In 1794, the President of the United States climbed onto a horse, strapped on a sword, and led 13,000 soldiers into battle. The enemy wasn't a foreign army. It wasn't a rebellion over land or liberty. It was over whiskey. George Washington marched his militia into western Pennsylvania to crush a group of farmers who refused to pay a tax on the liquor they distilled from their own corn. 5 years later, that same George Washington was running one of the largest whiskey distilleries in the entire country. Nearly 11,000 gallons a year, commis from his own estate at Mount Vernon. The man who waged war against whiskey makers became one himself. And that contradiction, that tension between rebellion and regulation, tradition and profit, runs through every chapter of bourbon's history. The government tried to control it, then it tried to destroy it. But bourbon's most dangerous enemy wasn't prohibition. It wasn't taxes. It wasn't even the law. It was America itself deciding it didn't want bourbon anymore. This is how a rough frontier drink became a national symbol, was nearly erased from American life, and came back so strong that today, the state that makes it holds more barrels of bourbon than it has people to drink it. To understand bourbon, you've got to start with a problem. In the 1600s, European settlers arrived on American soil with a skill they considered almost as important as farming. They knew how to turn grain into whiskey. Scottish, Irish, German, and Dutch immigrants had been distilling for generations. Back in Europe, barley was the base. But American soil had different plans. The humid, rocky ground of Virginia and the Carolinas made barley difficult to grow. Corn, on the other hand, was everywhere. Native Americans had been cultivating it for thousands of years. It grew fast. It grew abundantly. And it was cheap, so the settlers adapted. They swapped barley for corn and started distilling a rougher, sweeter spirit. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't refined, it was raw, cloudy, and harsh. But it served a purpose most people today don't realize. In frontier America, whiskey was safer to drink than water. Rivers and wells were often contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery and cholera. People got sick. People died. Distilled spirits didn't carry disease, so when a farmer turned his surplus corn into whiskey, he wasn't making a party drink. He was preserving food and protecting his family's health. But whiskey did something else that most people today forget. It functioned as money. On the frontier, actual currency was almost non-existent. Coins were scarce, paper money was unreliable. But a jug of whiskey? Everyone accepted it. Farmers paid workers in whiskey. They settled debts with it. They traded it for tools, fabric, salt, and gunpowder. In the 1810 census, Virginia alone had more than 3,600 registered distilleries. That wasn't an industry. That was a financial system. By the time the American Revolution ended in 1783, settlers were flooding through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky by the thousands. Land was cheap. Opportunity was enormous. And Kentucky had something no one fully appreciated yet. The ground was laced with limestone. That stone naturally filtered the water, removing iron, which ruins fermentation, and adding calcium and magnesium, which feed yeast. The climate swung between blazing summers and freezing winters, which would later prove critical for aging whiskey in wooden barrels. Corn grew easily in the warm, fertile valleys. But here's the question the early settlers didn't ask. They already had corn whiskey. Everybody did. Farmers across Appalachia, Virginia, and the Carolinas made it. So what would eventually make Kentucky's version different from everyone else's? It wasn't just the water, it wasn't just the corn, it was what happened to the whiskey after it left the still. The barrel, the river, and a name stamped on the outside. But that transformation took decades, and it didn't happen by genius. It happened by accident, geography, and a fire that may or may not have actually occurred. In 1785, while Kentucky was still technically part of Virginia, a massive swath of frontier territory was named Bourbon County. The name honored the French royal family, a thank you for France's help during the Revolution. The same reason Louisville, Versailles, and Paris, Kentucky all got their names. This original Bourbon County was enormous. It eventually split into 34 of today's modern Kentucky counties. But while it was still one giant region, farmer distillers did something simple that changed the whiskey business forever. They loaded their barrels onto flatboats and floated them down the Ohio River toward New Orleans. The barrels were stamped with their port of origin, Maysville, which sat inside Bourbon County's borders. Old Bourbon was branded right onto the wood. Now, something happened on those flatboats that nobody planned. The journey from Maysville to New Orleans took weeks, sometimes months. The barrels sat on open decks under the sun and rain. The whiskey inside expanded into the charred wood during the heat and contracted back during the cool nights. Day after day, week after week. By the time those barrels reached New Orleans, the whiskey inside had changed. The charred oak had filtered out harsh flavors and added new ones: vanilla, caramel, a warm sweetness that raw corn whiskey never had. The liquid had turned from clear to amber. It tasted richer, smoother, more complex. For buyers in New Orleans, that Old Bourbon stamp became a signal. This whiskey was different from anything else on the dock. It was corn-based, not rye-based, and it had that distinctive color and depth that only came from time inside charred oak. In time, the name stopped meaning "from this region." It started meaning "this kind of whiskey." The county kept shrinking. The name on the barrels didn't. And here's the detail that makes historians smile. There's still a Bourbon County in Kentucky today. It sits east of Lexington. But for 95 years, from 1919 to 2014, not a single distillery operated within its borders. The county that gave bourbon its name stopped making any. The county explains bourbon's name. It doesn't explain the charred barrel. And that mystery created an even bigger legend. If you've ever taken a distillery tour, you've heard the story of Elijah Craig, a Baptist minister in late 1700s Kentucky. The legend says a fire broke out in his barn and scorched the insides of his whiskey barrels. Rather than throw them away, the frugal reverend used them anyway. When the whiskey came out months later, it was smoother, richer, more complex than anything he'd tasted. It's a wonderful story. It's on a popular bourbon label. Heaven Hill Distillery still calls Craig the father of bourbon. There's one problem. It almost certainly isn't true. The first time anyone connected Craig to bourbon in print was in an 1874 book, written 66 years after Craig died. He never claimed the invention himself. None of his contemporaries credited him either. And the technique of charring barrel interiors? The French had been doing it for centuries with cognac. It wasn't a Kentucky breakthrough. It was an old-world practice that frontier distillers either borrowed or stumbled onto independently in different places around the same time. Historian Michael Veitch has spent decades studying this. His conclusion is blunt. No single person invented bourbon. There was no eureka moment, no heroic accident. The tale of Elijah Craig was popularized during Kentucky's bicentennial celebration in 1989, when a fictional play dramatized him accidentally charring barrels on April 30th, 1789, the same day George Washington was inaugurated as president. Great theater, not great history. In reality, bourbon evolved through hundreds of farmer distillers across decades, each one making small adjustments to grain ratios, charring methods, and aging times. A distiller in one county might notice that whiskey stored in a barrel previously used for sugar tasted better. Another might experiment with burning the inside of new barrels to clean them and discover the flavor improved. These weren't coordinated breakthroughs. They were scattered, independent experiments by people who had no idea what the person in the next county was doing. The real story is messier than the myth. It's also more interesting, because bourbon wasn't created by a genius. It was created by a culture, by people who needed to survive, improvise, and trade. Craig may not have invented bourbon, but the legend he represents, the resourceful, stubborn American who turns a mistake into something better. That's the spirit bourbon was actually built on. But if bourbon's birth was slow and gradual, the government's reaction to it was anything but. In 1791, the new United States Congress did something that pushed thousands of angry farmers to the edge of armed revolution, and the conflict that followed would reshape where bourbon was made. For good. The revolution was over. America had won its independence. But the bill came due. The new nation was drowning in war debt. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, needed revenue fast. He looked at the most popular product in frontier America and saw a tax base. In 1791, Congress passed the first ever federal excise tax on domestically produced spirits. For wealthy Easterners who bought their whiskey at market, the tax was an inconvenience. For frontier farmers, it was an existential threat. You've got to understand what whiskey meant to these people. A bushel of corn was heavy, bulky, and nearly impossible to transport across the Allegheny Mountains to eastern markets. But a gallon of corn whiskey? Light. Portable. Practically indestructible. Many farmers didn't even drink most of what they made. They traded it. They paid debts with it. Whiskey was their economy, and Hamilton's tax had to be paid in cash, hard currency, the one thing most frontier farmers didn't have. They bartered. They traded goods. Cash was scarce and often worthless at the edges of the frontier. Imagine being told you owed a tax on the only product keeping your family solvent. And you had to pay that tax in a currency you couldn't get. The resistance started small. Tax collectors were threatened. A few were tarred and feathered. Local courts refused to enforce the law. For 3 years, tension built. Then, in the summer of 1794, it exploded. In July, a U.S. Marshal and regional tax inspector named John Neville rode out to serve writs to farmers who hadn't paid. Shots were fired. The next day, nearly 500 armed rebels surrounded Neville's home, a plantation called Bower Hill. A firefight broke out. At least one rebel was killed. The house was burned to the ground. A month later, 6,000 furious farmers gathered at Braddock's Field, just outside Pittsburgh. Some carried homemade guillotines. Others waved a newly designed flag, 6 stripes for 6 rebel counties, and openly discussed seceding from the United States to join Spain or Britain. Were these men dangerous radicals? Or were they farmers driven to desperation by a tax they couldn't afford, collected in a currency they didn't have? It didn't matter. Washington responded with overwhelming force. He issued a proclamation on August 7th declaring the uprising a treasonous act. He called up nearly 13,000 militia troops from 4 states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, and personally rode west to lead them. It was a force larger than the army he'd commanded during most of the Revolution. By the time they reached western Pennsylvania in November, most of the rebels had scattered into the mountains. What followed wasn't justice. It was a dragnet. About 150 people were arrested in chaotic nighttime raids, pulled from their beds with no distinction made between actual participants and bystanders. Citizens were marched barefoot through muddy roads and icy streams, then held in basements, cellars, and animal pens. The conditions were so brutal that the event became known locally as the Dreadful Night. Only 2 men were ultimately convicted of treason. Washington pardoned them both. The rebellion was crushed. The government had made its point, but the consequences were enormous. And not in the way Hamilton expected. Thousands of farmer distillers who didn't want to deal with federal enforcement simply left. They packed their stills, their grain, and their families, and moved further west, deeper into Kentucky, where the government's reach was thinner and the corn grew tall. Kentucky's distilling population surged. The very tax that was supposed to control whiskey ended up concentrating whiskey production in the one state that would become its permanent home. Thomas Jefferson repealed the whiskey tax in 1802, but by then the damage and the migration was done. And speaking of Washington, within 3 years of crushing the rebellion, he retired to Mount Vernon, listened to his Scottish farm manager James Anderson, and built a distillery on his own estate. By 1799, the year Washington died, that distillery was producing nearly 11,000 gallons a year, worth $7,500, making it one of the largest whiskey operations in the entire country. Washington proved the government could control whiskey. Then he discovered how profitable whiskey could be. But as bourbon's popularity grew through the 1800s, a new threat emerged, one that didn't come from the government. It came from the bottles themselves. By the mid-1800s, bourbon was booming. Kentucky distillers shipped barrels downriver to New Orleans and outward across the country. Demand was enormous, and where there's demand without regulation, there are people willing to cheat. Counterfeit whiskey flooded the market. The scam was simple. Take cheap grain alcohol or raw moonshine, product that cost almost nothing to make, add iodine for color, tobacco spit for flavor, prune juice for sweetness. Some producers used turpentine. The worst used outright poisons. Then pour it into a barrel, slap on a label, and sell it as aged Kentucky bourbon. There was no regulation, no required labeling, no government inspection. A buyer picking up a bottle of bourbon in a general store or saloon had absolutely no way to verify what was inside it. At best, he got swindled, paying bourbon prices for bottom-shelf moonshine dressed up with food coloring. At worst, he got poisoned. And people did get poisoned. Newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s ran stories of blindness, convulsions, organ failure, and death linked to adulterated whiskey. A Brooklyn man named Michael McCarran died in 1891 after drinking what was sold to him as whiskey, but later found to contain methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, a substance that destroys the optic nerve and shuts down the kidneys. He wasn't alone. Cases like his appeared in cities and towns across the country. Some victims survived but lost their eyesight permanently. Others weren't so lucky. The scale of the fraud was staggering. By some accounts, a significant portion of all whiskey sold in the United States during the late 1800s was adulterated in some way. The legitimate product and the counterfeit sat side by side on the same shelves. Nobody could tell the difference until it was too late. For honest distillers, men who spent years aging real bourbon in real barrels, this was both an economic disaster and a moral crisis. Every poisoned customer, every newspaper headline, every death. It all landed on the reputation of an industry that couldn't separate itself from the criminals riding its coattails. One man decided the only solution was the government itself. One man decided to fight. Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. was a Kentucky distiller, a politician, and a man who believed whiskey could be both profitable and honest. Alongside allies like James E. Pepper, Taylor spent years lobbying Congress for a quality standard. The debate was fierce. On one side stood the straight whiskey producers, who wanted government-backed verification. On the other stood the rectifiers, blenders who mixed and doctored spirits, who had every financial reason to keep the system unregulated. On March 3, 1897, Congress passed the Bottled in Bond Act. It is often described as the first federal consumer protection law in American history, predating the Pure Food and Drug Act by 9 years. The rules were strict. To earn the bonded label, a whiskey had to be the product of one distillation season, either January through June or July through December, made by one distiller at one distillery. It had to age for at least 4 years in a federally supervised bonded warehouse. Government agents controlled access to those warehouses, physically overseeing the aging and bottling process, and the final product had to be bottled at exactly 100 proof. No exceptions. Each bottle received a distinctive green tax stamp showing the distillery that made the spirit, the distillery that bottled it, the year and season it was produced, and the year it was bottled. Severe penalties were imposed for reusing or counterfeiting those stamps. Think about what that meant for a buyer standing in a store in 1900. For the first time in bourbon's history, he could pick up a bottle, read the stamp, and know exactly what it was inside. Who made it? Where? When? How strong? No guessing. No gambling, no risk of poison. The Bottled in Bond Act didn't just punish cheaters. It gave legitimate bourbon something it had never had before. Credibility. A verifiable standard. A promise sealed in glass and backed by the full authority of the United States government. The act later served as a template for the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which extended similar protections across the entire food industry. That credibility was about to face the most devastating test any American industry has ever endured, because 23 years later, the government that protected bourbon would try to erase it from existence. In 1920, bourbon became illegal, unless your doctor prescribed it. That sounds like a joke. It wasn't. When the Volstead Act took effect on January 17, 1920, it banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the United States. The 18th Amendment was supposed to end crime, corruption, and moral decay. In practice, it created an underground empire worth millions. But Prohibition didn't arrive suddenly. Wartime restrictions during World War I had already shut down most distilleries by 1917. By the time the official ban hit, whiskey production in America had effectively been dead for 3 years. Combined, it would stay dead for 16. Across Kentucky, distillery doors were padlocked overnight. Workers who'd spent their entire lives around copper stills and charred oak barrels found themselves unemployed. Cooperatives closed. Grain contracts dissolved. Supply networks that had taken a century to build collapsed in months. James Jim Beauregard Beam reportedly padlocked the doors at the Old Tub distillery himself, but not before allegedly hauling one large barrel of bourbon up to his home attic for personal use. He then watched helplessly as the distillery was destroyed. Whether the destruction came from government agents, temperance activists, or opportunistic looters remains unclear. Some distillers pivoted. A few produced industrial alcohol. Others converted to vinegar manufacturing. Some started trucking companies, but these were survival moves, not business strategies. Revenue plummeted. Families that had distilled whiskey for 4 or 5 generations found themselves doing something else entirely. And then there was the loophole. The government allowed a small number of companies to keep producing whiskey for medicinal purposes. How many companies received those licenses? 6. Out of hundreds of distilleries across Kentucky and the broader country, 6 companies were authorized to sell bourbon by prescription. If you had a sympathetic doctor, and plenty of doctors were sympathetic, you walked into a pharmacy, presented your prescription slip, and walked out with a pint of perfectly legal bourbon. The diagnosis on the form might say nerves. It might say indigestion. It might say almost anything. Nobody checked. The system was openly, shamelessly abused. During Prohibition, the number of registered pharmacies in America surged. The Walgreens chain reportedly grew from around 20 stores to over 500 during those 13 years, and historians have long debated how much of that expansion was driven by their ability to sell medicinal alcohol. For the vast majority of distillers, those without one of the 6 golden licenses, the situation was dire. They had barrels of aging whiskey in their warehouses, whiskey they couldn't sell, whiskey they couldn't even legally move. Their only options were grim. Sell your barrels to one of the licensed companies for whatever price they offered, usually far below market value. Or sit on your inventory and pray Prohibition would end before your savings ran out. Most couldn't wait. Meanwhile, the void left by legal whiskey was eagerly filled by bootleggers and organized crime. Underground liquor networks stretched from Canada to the Gulf Coast, generating fortunes for men willing to break the law on an industrial scale. Speakeasies, hidden bars operating behind locked doors, in basements and behind false storefronts, opened in every major city. New York alone reportedly had more than 30,000 during the height of Prohibition, more than double the number of legal bars that had existed before the ban. Cities like Chicago became infamous for corruption and violence, as rival gangs fought bloody turf wars over the right to supply illegal alcohol. The very crime and moral decay that Prohibition was designed to eliminate exploded instead. By some estimates, alcohol consumption actually rose during Prohibition. The ban didn't stop Americans from drinking. It just stopped them from drinking safely, legally, and predictably. On December 5, 1933, Prohibition was finally repealed. The 18th Amendment was dead. Distilleries could reopen. But bourbon had one more problem nobody anticipated. The whiskey that had survived Prohibition had been sitting in barrels for up to 20 years. Normal bourbon ages 4 to 8 years. After too many years in oak, whiskey absorbs excessive tannins from the wood, leaving it bitter, harsh, dry, and dominated by an overwhelming woodiness. The liquid was nearly undrinkable. Consumers tasted this overaged bourbon, grimaced, and reached for something else. Scotch and Canadian whiskey had flooded into the American market after repeal, fresh, approachable, and unburdened by 16 years of neglect. Many bourbon drinkers switched. A lot of them never came back. Prohibition didn't just destroy bourbon's production capacity. It didn't just close distilleries and bankrupt families. It did something more insidious than all of that combined. It erased bourbon from an entire generation's memory. The people who came of age between 1917 and 1933, 16 years without legal American whiskey, never developed a taste for bourbon. They never sat with their fathers and learned what good whiskey tasted like. They never formed the habits, the preferences, the loyalty that turns a product into a tradition. When they finally could drink legally, they reached for Scotch. They reached for Canadian whiskey. They reached for whatever was fresh, available, and unburdened by a decade and a half of neglect. Bourbon didn't just lose time, it lost inheritance. The chain of taste that had been passed from generation to generation for over a century was broken. Rebuilding it would take decades, and it would start with a 70-year-old man and a stack of lumber. Jim Beam was 70 years old when Prohibition ended in 1933. He'd spent 13 years watching the industry he'd been born into crumble. Most men that age would have accepted the loss and retired. Beam didn't. He went back to Kentucky, bought a piece of land in Claremont, and recruited family and friends to build a new distillery from scratch. Not rebuild. Build. The old facility had been destroyed during Prohibition. This was starting from nothing, clearing land, laying foundations, installing stills, constructing warehouses. They did it in 120 days, 4 months from bare earth to flowing spirits. On August 14, 1934, the James B. Beam Distilling Company was officially incorporated, and whiskey was running through copper again. Other families did the same across Kentucky. The Samuels returned to their land. The Brown family, founders of Brown-Forman, pressed forward with Old Forester. The Van Winkles reopened at Stitzel-Weller. Bourbon was, and always had been, a family business, and these families refused to let it die. Through the 1940s and 1950s, bourbon fought its way back. Post-war America embraced whiskey again. Mad Men culture made brown liquor fashionable. Sales climbed steadily. By the early 1960s, bourbon had regained its footing. And in 1964, Congress gave bourbon something it had never officially had: a legal identity. A concurrent resolution declared bourbon whiskey a distinctive product of the United States. Foreign-made whiskey could no longer use the name. From that moment forward, if it wasn't made in America, it wasn't bourbon. Congress had protected bourbon's name. It couldn't make Americans drink it. Bourbon hit peak sales in 1970, 80 million cases in a single year. Then it collapsed. The counterculture of the late 1960s and 1970s rejected everything the previous generation valued, including their parents' drink. Younger Americans reached for vodka, tequila, gin, and wine coolers. Lighter spirits, clearer liquids. Bourbon became, in the culture's eyes, an old man's drink. Something your grandfather nursed in a wood-paneled den. At the same time, distillers had massively overproduced. They'd expected another wartime shortage after the Korean War. The shortage never came. Then younger drinkers abandoned bourbon entirely. Warehouses filled with whiskey nobody wanted. Distillers panicked. They slashed prices. And the price cuts backfired. They cheapened bourbon's reputation even further. It became the cheapest spirit on the shelf. Some retailers practically gave it away. The perception calcified. Bourbon was a bottom-shelf drink for people who couldn't afford anything better. Between 1970 and 1990, bourbon lost nearly half its market share. The industry tried everything. Wild Turkey released a honey-flavored bourbon liqueur in 1976. Other producers created light whiskey, a higher-proof, stripped-down product designed to compete directly with vodka. It had no distinctive flavor, no complexity, no reason to exist. Consumers rejected it immediately. It became one of the great failed experiments in spirits history. Some distillers turned to ceramic decanters, collectible bottles shaped like cars, eagles, and historical figures, hoping novelty would substitute for demand. It didn't. The decanters sold, but they didn't bring new drinkers to bourbon. They just added to the growing sense that the industry was desperate. Historic brands vanished. Distilleries that had operated continuously since before the Civil War went silent. The Stitzel-Weller Distillery in Louisville, founded by the legendary Julian "Pappy" Van Winkle Sr., shut down in 1992 after years of declining sales. A place that had once produced some of the most celebrated bourbon in America sat empty, its warehouses full of aging whiskey that the market didn't want. Workers who'd spent their entire careers around copper stills and charred oak barrels found themselves unemployed. Some families had distilled whiskey for 3 or 4 generations. Their children moved into different industries entirely. The knowledge, the craft, the instinct, the generational understanding of how bourbon matures began to evaporate along with the jobs. By the mid-1980s, bourbon was so unwanted in its own country that some Kentucky distillers were shipping their product exclusively to Japan, where a youth culture obsessed with Western aesthetics had developed an unlikely appreciation for American whiskey. The irony was painful. America's official national spirit was being kept alive by customers on the other side of the planet. The spirit that Congress had declared a national treasure was being treated like a relic in its own homeland. But deep inside one particular warehouse in Frankfort, Kentucky, one man was about to risk his reputation on an idea that went against every instinct in the industry. Elmer T. Lee had worked at what is now Buffalo Trace Distillery since 1949. He started under Colonel Albert Blanton, the distillery's longtime president, a man who'd begun working there in 1897 as a 16-year-old office boy. Blanton had a habit that set him apart. He'd walk through Warehouse H, a metal-clad building where temperature swings were more extreme than in traditional rick houses, pushing the whiskey deeper into the charred wood and pulling it back out season after season. Inside that warehouse, Blanton would taste barrels one at a time. When he found one that was exceptional, richer, smoother, more complex than the rest, he'd mark it. He called them honey barrels. He'd pour them for governors, senators, and VIP guests. Nobody ever sold those barrels individually. They were blended into larger batches like everyone else's whiskey. In 1984, Lee was nearing retirement. He'd spent 35 years at this distillery. He remembered Blanton's honey barrels. He remembered the taste of those single exceptional casks. And he had an idea that most people in the industry thought was insane. At a time when bourbon was being heavily discounted, when distilleries were slashing prices, closing doors, and running out of ideas, Lee proposed the opposite. He wanted to bottle bourbon from a single barrel, charge a premium for it, and market it as a luxury product. Think about what he was proposing. Most bourbon at the time sold for a few dollars a bottle. Distillers were practically giving it away to clear inventory. The entire industry consensus said the only path forward was to make bourbon cheaper, lighter, and more like the spirits that were actually selling. Lee said the opposite: charge more, make it rarer. Treat bourbon not as a commodity, but as a craft product worth savoring. Most bourbon at the time was blended from hundreds of barrels to create a uniform product. Lee wanted to bottle from a single barrel, one cask, one unique expression. Priced at $25, which in 1984 dollars, adjusted for inflation, is roughly $75 today, for a spirit the country had largely stopped caring about. The product was named Blanton's Single Barrel Bourbon, after the man whose honey barrel tradition inspired it. Each bottle came from one individual barrel in Warehouse H. No two bottles were exactly alike. The packaging was deliberately luxurious. A round bottle that stood apart from every rectangular competitor on the shelf. A collectible stopper shaped like a horse and jockey at different stages of a race, each stamped with a letter from the word Blanton's. Even the wax-dipped neck was designed to signal that this was something special. It was the first commercially marketed single-barrel bourbon in modern history. It was advertised in the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal, positioned not as a working man's drink, but as a luxury product. And against every reasonable expectation, it worked. Blanton's didn't just sell, it proved a theory that would reshape the entire industry. People would pay more for bourbon if you gave them a reason to. If you gave them a story, a specific barrel, a unique experience. Within a few years, other distilleries followed. Jim Beam launched its small batch collection: Knob Creek, Basil Hayden's, Baker's, and Booker's. Maker's Mark doubled down on its handcrafted, hand-dipped identity. Woodford Reserve invested in heritage and sense of place. The strategy that saved bourbon was the opposite of what had nearly killed it. Stop racing to the bottom on price. Start competing on quality, story, and craft. And something else shifted alongside the business strategy. The culture changed. The same generation that had dismissed bourbon as their grandfather's drink in the 1970s started rediscovering it in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Cocktail bars in New York, San Francisco, and Chicago began featuring bourbon, old fashions, and Manhattans as centerpieces of their menus. Bartenders who'd spent a decade perfecting vodka martinis started talking about mash bills and barrel proof and warehouse placement. Bourbon wasn't just tolerated again, it was cool, it was sought after. It was the drink of people who wanted something authentic in an era that felt increasingly artificial. Craft distilleries started appearing outside Kentucky, in Brooklyn, in Texas, in Oregon. Each one brought new experimentation, new grain combinations, new barrel finishes, new interpretations of what bourbon could be. The numbers told the story of a resurrection. Kentucky went from fewer than 20 licensed distilleries in 2009 to more than 100 by 2024. As of early 2025, the state holds 16.1 million barrels of bourbon aging in its warehouses. Kentucky has about 4.5 million residents. That's roughly 3.5 barrels of bourbon for every single person in the state, men, women, and children included. Bourbon didn't just come back in America, it conquered markets that had never paid attention to it before. Japan, which had quietly been buying Kentucky bourbon since the dark days of the 1980s when nobody in America wanted it, became a massive export partner. Europe followed, Australia followed, the Middle East, South Korea, and India followed after that. Premium bottles started commanding extraordinary prices. Limited annual releases like Pappy Van Winkle, George T. Stagg, and William LaRue Weller became the whiskey world's equivalent of fine art. Bottles that retailed for $80 or $100 were resold for $2,000 or $3,000 on the secondary market. Collectors camped outside liquor stores. Online lotteries determined who could even buy certain brands. Distillery tours became destination tourism, with the Kentucky Bourbon Trail drawing more than 2 million visitors a year. The spirit that was nearly killed by Prohibition, then abandoned by its own country, had become one of the most valuable luxury categories in the world. And every single bottle starts the same way it did 250 years ago. Corn from a field, water filtered through limestone, yeast, heat, copper, fire, and oak. Then silence. Years of silence. While the whiskey and the barrel slowly, invisibly, change each other in the dark. No one can rush it. No one can fake it. A spirit that survived revolution, a constitutional ban, cultural abandonment, and corporate neglect. It's still here. Still aging. Still waiting in the dark of a charred oak barrel for its moment. That's bourbon. If this story surprised you, there's one you'll want to hear next. How a single bottle of Pappy Van Winkle went from a $20 shelf-sitter nobody wanted to the most hunted whiskey on earth. That video's right here. And if you want more stories like this, the real history behind the things we take for granted, subscribe. New ones drop every week. Cheers.